Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you here today to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's talk is about metropolitan governance, future necessity or misplaced dream. Don't you love that title? Our guest speaker is Alan Harding from the UK. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the Munk School for sponsoring this event as part of their distinguished lecture series. We are delighted to be co-hosting the event today with the Urban Policy Lab here at the Munk School. Gabe Edelman, who's here, he's the director of the Urban Policy Lab, and he will make some comments at the end of our discussion today. Alan Harding is visiting Toronto as an IMFG visiting scholar, and will be doing further research and be at some other events on the topic of metropolitan governance over the course of the next 6 weeks. I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute for making his visit possible: Havana Capital, the Maitrey Foundation, the Province of Ontario, the City of Toronto, the Region of York, and the Region of Halton. I would also like to thank Thomas Hatchard here, who's our Manager of Research and Programs at IMFG, and the events staff and the technical staff of the Munk School for making this all run smoothly, I hope. If you're tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFGToronto. So I'd like now to turn to our moderator for today, who is Shirley Hoy. Shirley's public service career has spanned more than 30 years. Between 2001 and 2008, Shirley served as the city manager for the City of Toronto. That, as you hear those years in your head, is after the amalgamation. In the early 1990s, Shirley worked in the Ontario government at the assistant deputy minister level in 3 ministries. Following her term as Toronto City Manager, she served for 5 years as the CEO of the Toronto Lands Corporation. Shirley has served as chair of the Governing Council of the University of Toronto and a member of the Board of Trustees of United Way of Greater Toronto and York Region. And of course, most importantly, Shirley is a member of the Board of Directors of IMFG. So we are delighted to have her here to moderate the session this afternoon. Please welcome Shirley Hoy.
Thank you very much, Enid. Well, I must say I'm absolutely honored to have this opportunity to introduce our distinguished speaker and to serve as moderator for the discussion. You know, this session is so timely in our current GTA Ontario context. The provincial government's review of a number of regional governments will be reporting out soon. In addition, with regard to key programs and services such as transit, public health, EMS, the province has also signaled possible structural changes for governance, which will impact municipal jurisdictions. I know that many of you, looking around, there are many old friends here in the room, you have views about regional metro governance, and indeed, like myself, have lived through some of the changes that have occurred in and around Toronto over the years. So just to recap briefly of Toronto's history with metropolitan governance, so Alan has a sense of where we've been. And to keep this in mind, as we hear about the experience in Greater Manchester from Professor Alan Harding. So two-tier municipal government existed in Toronto from 1954 to 1998. In its heyday, the two-tier municipal system was known as being ahead of the curve, especially in public transit. So much so that the famous quote by the actor Peter Ustinov was, "Toronto is New York run by the Swiss." And I'm sure many of us remember the quote in those days. In the 1990s, under Premier Harris, there was a desire to achieve greater efficiency in municipal governments around the GTA. And some of you may recall, the Greater Toronto Services Board was created to replace Metro Toronto Council, and the adjacent regional councils. However, the GTSB existed only briefly between 1998 to 2001, and mainly it dealt with managing GO Transit. In 1998, after a lot of angst and chagrin, amalgamation in the city of Toronto occurred. So now, more than 20 years later, we're still talking and debating about the benefits and the failures of amalgamation. So this is our context, Alan. And we're eager to hear about what happened elsewhere with regard to regional governance. So a little bit about our keynote speaker. As Enid already said, Alan Harding is the Chief Economic Advisor at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, or the GMCA, and a visiting professor at the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research in the Alliance Manchester Business School. He oversees the analytical work that supports GMCA's research and intelligence, strategic development, and evaluation efforts. Most recently, he was centrally involved in the production of the Greater Manchester Independent Prosperity Review, which was a major collaborative initiative with leading academic experts designed to provide the evidence base for one of UK's first modern local industrial strategies. Previously, Alan spent 30 years in academia, leading specialist research institutes and centres in north of England, focusing on urban regional development, policy and governance. But he's best known for his role in re-establishing the importance of the city region as a scale for policy development and delivery in England. So please help me welcome Alan to the podium. Look forward.
Shirley, thanks very much indeed, and welcome everybody. It's a little daunting to see this sort of size of turnout. There's very few empty seats, unlike the game I saw of the Blue Jays last week. It's whilst we're on thanks, let me also extend a few thank yous to Enid and Thomas and all their colleagues at IMFG for inviting me here in the first place. For giving me such a gracious and warm welcome since I arrived. Thanks also to the Monk School for providing all of those sponsors who managed to get me over here, and also to the Urban Policy Lab for supporting tonight's event. And this is going to sound a little corny, but I'd like to say a vote of thanks to the people of Toronto too, because I've had the good fortune a couple of times to pay a fleeting visit to the city over the years. But I've never actually lived as a Torontonian, as it were. Is that what you call yourselves? Yeah, okay. So I'm living in the beaches at the moment, in a house I've taken over from one of my academic colleagues who's on vacation. He's doing a sabbatical year. So I'm a proper Torontonian. I'm hanging around the beaches and enjoying myself enormously, I have to say. So thanks to everybody who's made that possible. The exam question you've got in front of you for tonight is, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer it. I was saying to Chris here, maybe we should have a vote at the end of this presentation. You can tell me what you think, having heard about the Manchester experience. But what I am going to do, here's the plan for the session. I'm going to try and get through 4 key questions in the next 45 minutes or so. I haven't got a clock, by the way, so if you want to start waving if I'm going over time, please do. First of all, just a quick recap about what's being claimed to be good about metropolitan governance in theory. We're all familiar with the way in which metropolitan governance has come into being, I think. Administrative territories very rarely match real functional urban areas or natural economic areas. We have to try and grow administrative territories in any way we can to do our best for the people living and working in those areas. I'm going to say a few things about what academics have claimed to be the goods in metropolitan governance. And then I'm going to pose the difficult question of, well, if it's that good, how come there aren't more examples of it? Shelley has just taken you through a brief history of Toronto within this field. It's a minefield, it has to be said. Choices are difficult, and there are reasons why people don't face them. But I'm then going to go on to talk a little bit, for the main part of my talk, about Greater Manchester, which stands alone in the UK as an area which has kind of invented metropolitan governance for itself, having had an authority which was abolished. I'll tell you that story as we go through. It's kind of invented it. It's dragged itself up by its own bootstraps, is the English phrase. In a way which doesn't have any comparisons in the rest of England. And I would venture to suggest has very few parallels in the developed world, actually. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you can decide as we go through. I'm going to say a few things about the nature of the institutions that we've managed to create in Greater Manchester, and then to go through some of the reasons that I think the metropolitan experiment has reached a higher stage of its development in Greater Manchester than it has in the rest of my country and in much of Europe. And then, if we get time, although Shirley's going to be grilling me on this later, I'm sure, we'll get to some of the implications for GM's experience within the UK. You'll realise that questions of constitutions and identities and geographies are pretty well front and centre of UK debate at the moment for very, very different reasons, but they do have some implications about how we go forward. But just to explore what implications our experience might have for any part of the world that is thinking of making these sorts of changes. So that's the plan. I am an academic, so I've been known to go on a bit. As I say, do let me know if we're running out of time. He's nodding there. Thank you. Okay, let you into a secret on this. When I talked to Enid before the presentation, she said, don't go heavy on the theory, you'll lose people. So, with apologies to academic colleagues who might want naming, and I can see one or two in the audience, I'm not going to go heavy on the theory. I'm simply going to point to a number of things that I think have been claimed by academics, by public intellectuals, by thinkers in this field as to why metropolitan governance makes sense, and it's all captured really in that first bullet point. In principle, metropolitan governance allows strategic decision-making for whatever you want to call it, a functional urban area, a natural economic area. Both of these terms recur in the writing about these things. Something which is not easily captured by administrative geographies, but nonetheless makes sense to people as they live their lives in a particular urban area. It can do this at the lowest feasible level, so it plays into all those arguments about the importance of subsidiarity, if I can get the word out, and potentially, therefore, it enables a maximum feasible democratic input by citizens. And I ought to pause at this point and say that certainly GM's experience is that we're learning as we go along quite how to make those connections between something which was once very technocratic, and I think that's a problem with all of this area, to something which is now led by a relatively popular, directly elected mayor for the first time from 2017. If you're an economist, you'll recognise the notion of internalising externalities. That's basically being able to capture the benefits of development within this extended, broad metropolitan zone. That can be through travel to work patterns and other linkages across space, to do with contracting, to do with money movements and so on. It also includes the negative bits about externalities, which means you can make strategic decisions about things like congestion, which I haven't experienced it actually, but I've heard a lot of people talking about Toronto as having one or two issues with congestion. Air quality, and so on and so forth. Having that unit enables you to broker some of these difficult debates in a better way than a fragmented system. And again, for the economists in the audience, there's been a lot of talk recently about the new agglomeration, as it were, which, when reduced to its absolute basics, I think is about the change, the economic changes, which are increasingly privileging big, dense, diverse, highly connected cities in the developed as well as the newly developed and developing worlds. So, and the final thing is about where cities fit within the broader international community and the extent to which national governments are losing some of the levers that they used to have in an increasingly globalised world. The big question mark, are city-states in some respects better at making some choices than nation-states are currently with all of the constraints that they face? Okay, so that's the theory done with. Why doesn't it work? For any number of reasons. Why don't we have more experiments than we do? All of the potential benefits I've just listed, of course, have their detractors as well as people who advance them. So every one of these things is disputed in the literature as well as advanced within it. But more important than that, I think some of these benefits are hard to realise in a practical day-to-day sense. So some of the barriers are contained in the rest of those bullet points. It can be pretty difficult to define what a metro scale is. I've seen a number of things in Toronto, from the GTA through to the Great Golden Horseshoe, I got it right, which suggests that the debates about space and interaction are not easy things to resolve, particularly when you've got politics of a large and a small p involved in the decision-making process. So getting to the right scale is difficult. Energising people with what are essentially quite technocratic arguments can be pretty difficult. So I'm sure the hockey crowds in Toronto, same as the football crowds in my adopted city of Manchester, are not exactly singing with debate about metropolitan governance as people are enjoying the game. Parochial politics is also a powerful barrier to metropolitan development, particularly when it's protected by constitutions. So, not talking about here, but in France, there are 36,000 municipalities for a population of about 60 million people. They are protected by the constitution. They can't be changed. They can be overridden, they can be got round, they can be cajoled and prodded. But there's going to be 36,000 mayors in France for as long as everybody in this audience is alive, I'm sure, and probably for much longer. The extent to which localities are constitutionally protected and their institutions makes a difference, it seems to me. And of course, change always generates losers as well as winners, particularly when there's money involved. So moving to a metropolitan structure, which at least initially tends to cost more money, and that money needs to be found somewhere, it has to be raised, that's going to generate winners and losers, and the winners tend to have the losers rather tend to have the louder voices in these debates. So for all of those reasons, it can be difficult to make the journey that Greater Manchester has been taking for the last at least 30 years, I would argue. So this is not an overnight sensation story by any stretch of the imagination. This is the result of hard work and leadership and incremental development over a very long period of time. So let's turn to Greater Manchester. Quick overview. You're probably aware of where Manchester is within the UK, but in case you don't, it's that red blob. In the northwest of England, Scotland is the big green bit to the top, Wales, Northern Ireland to the west, and Wales is not far away from Greater Manchester. They are the nations of the UK. We don't have anything like that within the English context. No great cultural identification with what are our administrative regions within England. A very checkered history of intermediate levels of government between the nation and the locality. As you probably know, Manchester makes claims to be the world's first major industrial city, and I'll go through a few slides later which shows you how the area has grown together over the ages, but that gives you a quick schematic view of the territory of Greater Manchester in the light colour on that map and the extent to which it's integrated by the transport network. So shown in blue there is a major motorway system. The inner ring there, which we call the M60, was only completed in, I think, 1990. But the area is interlinked by all sorts of transportation routes, road, rail. The first new set of trams in any British city was started in the 1990s. So there's an amazing amount of interaction across all of the borders between the districts in the area. People simply don't notice when they travel from one district, even one city, to another, technically. That gives you an idea of the composition. Those are the 10 districts with their population. Just short of 3 million people living in the Greater Manchester area. Manchester, the city of Manchester being the first among equals, as it were. It's the largest of the authorities. It's the centre of the highest level economic activity in the city region. It's also the fastest growing of the districts. So population kind of peaked in the 1960s, remained roughly level for the next period, and it's only really been in the last decade driven by a whole spate of condo developments in the middle of the city, where the population has started to increase again. New in-migrants and the children of migrant families are responsible for most of the population increase across the conurbation. I said a little bit about the difference between administrative territories and broader economic areas. This is just one illustration of the way you can try and visualise that. So the 10 districts of Greater Manchester are shown in green on this map. They're the political and administrative entity that goes up to make Greater Manchester. The red line is just one version of a travel to work area prepared from census tracts quite a while ago now. What that shows you is that depending on what cut-off you have, I think that's the red line represents something like 15% of people travelling into the centre of the conurbation to work on a daily basis. There is a good fit between the administrative entity and at least one version of the economic entity, as seen through travel to work patterns, but the latter does extend beyond the administrative patch, as it were, particularly into the southern areas there. Interestingly, there have been versions of Greater Manchester proposed in the past, which would have taken those territories into the administrative unit. They were successfully resisted by people who tend to live in quite affluent areas, tend to have most of the decent jobs in Manchester regional centre, and tend not to want to be taken over by the big city. Surprise, surprise. Just a few quick facts about the economy. I've said 2.8 million people, growing population, 110,000 businesses, very much dominated by small to medium-sized firms, very few of the top-level corporates and headquarters, which certainly in the English case is increasingly dominated by London, but some quite vibrant sectors. The university is particularly critical to the city. We have spread across 5 institutions, more than 100,000 students in a population of just less than 3 million, which I think is roughly comparable to what you'd be talking about in Toronto, another major centre of advanced higher education. £58 billion per year gross value added economy, which is bigger than some of our countries in the UK, bigger than Wales, for example, and certainly bigger than some of the English regions. So it is in many senses the number 2 city region within the UK, and likes to proclaim that loudly depending on who the audience is. Not Birmingham, obviously. That just encapsulates some of the major assets. A major international airport, the biggest outside London in the southeast, growing all the time. Something of a hub for global traffic through a system of sister hub airports in particularly the United Arab Emirates. Massive concentration of scientific activity in what we call the corridor, which links some of the major university sites. Media and tech businesses have had a major shot in the arm in the last decade by the BBC, our main state news broadcaster, moving a number of its functions into Salford, the sister city to Manchester. You don't notice when you pass between Manchester and Salford, although Salford does claim very loudly that it is the home of the BBC and not Manchester, of course. So all sorts of new modern economic activities being attracted into the area over the last decade or so, 20 years. I mentioned big and small p politics. This just gives you a sense of the churn in political domination of the 10 districts in Greater Manchester. You'll notice, so red is Labour, blue is Conservative, yellow is Liberal Democrat, grey is no overall control. Like most of the major areas, urban areas in the UK, GM has traditionally been dominated by the Labour Party. However, there is significant change from decade to decade, depending on their fortunes nationally. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, big red blob, much more mixed picture. 15 years ago, the most recent elections, actually that has changed. So I think there are two grey areas rather than one blue and one grey. All this means that the politics of the city region is always very lively, and it doesn't, funnily enough, tend to depend on whether there is actual political party arguments over development strategy. They can occur between two Labour authorities that are neighbours as well. Okay, quick story about institutional development in GM. I have to backtrack a little bit and say the first time GM Greater Manchester ever became a thing was as a result of a huge local government reorganisation that occurred in the 1970s. We are a highly centralised country. We're a unitary state. National government is all-powerful when it chooses to be so, and local governments are the creation of national statutes. So national government can, if and when it wants, change the functions, the geographies, the status of local government as it wishes. The biggest reorganisation we had was the first for over a century, and if I wanted to try and capture what it was trying to do in a sentence, it was trying to develop a system of governance which reflected industrial patterns of organisation and movement, rather than the rural system, which tended to divide city from countryside, which had been the basis of local government for the previous century. What we had over that century was a series of amalgamations, of cities pinching territory, a load of ad hoc initiatives which didn't make any sense. What the 1974 reorganisation did is reduce the number of local authorities from something around 1,700 to what it is today, roughly 330, if memory serves me right. So what we have in the UK is big local government areas, much bigger than in some areas of the world. The argument that happened over that reorganisation really focused on the notion of city regions and metropolitan areas. So there were two counter proposals put forward by a sort of a think tank, a great and good intelligence operation appointed by government to advise on the change. one of which recommended a countrywide system of unitary local authorities. So everybody would have their services delivered by a single local authority, making the connection very clear about who you're voting for, who you're paying taxes to, and what services you're getting. That was the major recommendation to government by the majority of this network of people advising, with the exception of 3 areas. So London had already gone through its own reorganisation, as it always does in our country. We think of London first. Manchester tries to follow, of course. London had been reorganised into what sounds like Toronto before the amalgamation. So it was a 2-tier system from about 1965 with an expanded territory. They also recommended a 2-tier system for just 3 other metropolitan areas, one of which was Manchester, one of which is its neighbouring city of Liverpool, its industrial sister city in many respects, and the other one being Birmingham. The alternative proposal was that we needed a 2-tier system everywhere, and that the size of the upper tier counties, whether metropolitan or not, should depend on the scale and interaction and complexity of those areas. So local authorities at the lower level delivering all the personal consumer-facing services, and strategic authorities of different sizes depending on the nature of the agglomeration, as it were. That led the person who made that recommendation to try and come up with a mental map of what these areas would actually look like. And he was drowned out by howls of protest from people who saw the name of their city disappearing. These places probably won't mean a great deal to you. Oxford you will have heard of. Oxford swallowed Swindon, which is a town with very few interactions, 30 miles down a motorway. Things like that made that unpopular. It was a brilliant scheme. I think probably the best scheme we've ever proposed. What the government who introduced the legislation which created the new system did was ignore both of those entirely. Create a 2-tier system where in the metropolitan areas, because a national Conservative government was concerned about giving power to what would be Labour-dominated authorities, made the metropolitan tier weaker in urban areas than it was in the traditional Conservative counties. So there was a lot of political machination which brought about a 2-tier system which lasted for precisely 12 years. So we had metropolitan authorities at an upper tier level, independent elections for 12 years, at which point Margaret Thatcher, who a few of you I'm sure will remember, didn't like Ken Livingstone, who a few might also remember, the leader of the GLC, the London Strategic Authority. The GLC was abolished, and because they didn't want to go to just a little bit of legislation to get rid of one authority in the country who was making their lives a little bit difficult at the time, they just abolished the whole set of metropolitan authorities. Now at that point, most of the other conurbations just settled into a system where functions were shared. Most of them were transferred back down to the district level. So you had 10 or 12 or 5 or whatever it was, planning authorities trying to integrate their work but doing it independently. Social services delivered 10, 5, 12 times over, and so on and so forth. Some of the strategic services were just vested in joint bodies. So like Shelley was talking about transportation authorities, all of the metropolitan areas had a metropolitan police force, a metropolitan fire service, a metropolitan transport operator. These were run separately through indirectly elected appointments to their boards. Not all of the appointees were necessarily the brightest or best or most ambitious politicians, it has to be said. So there was a great deal of institutional fragmentation, which most metropolitan areas just kind of lived with and got on as best they could. In Greater Manchester, apart from keeping those joint bodies going and having a hand in their governance, there was a slow process of realisation that the degree of interaction between the core of the conurbation in particular and its suburbs was sufficiently intense, and the administrative geography was sufficiently insane that actually continuing with a voluntary cooperative arrangement seemed to make sense. So the first thing that happened virtually the day that the old Metropolitan County was abolished was that a new voluntary body was created called AGMA, the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities. And then through time, as those districts relearned how to get along in a different sort of world, they started to create from the bottom up a whole set of metropolitan institutions, starting very much with economic development, transport, and related sort of functions. So I'll show you a slide in a second which shows you the transition as these agencies came into view. But things like inward investment promotion, visitor attraction, marketing of the city and the city region, or generally, these were developed in stages over a 10, 15-year period. So that by the early 2000s, Greater Manchester alone, amongst all of the metropolitan areas in England, had a set of metropolitan institutions which they had put their hands in the pockets to build for themselves and wanted to get onto the next stage. At this point in time, national government wasn't paying attention to any of this stuff, it has to be said. The Tony Blair government of the late 90s, early noughties, had a very limited experiment with regional governance. We had regional development agencies for a time. We had regional oversight by indirectly elected bodies of one sort or another, but regions never took hold in England, in direct contrast to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, where there is a sense of nationhood and cultural capital that binds them together. So at the appropriate time, Greater Manchester started making the argument that actually building something statutory on the basis of all of these voluntary contributions and collaborations over time made sense, and there was a particular trigger point which I'll come to as I show you this transition slide. So that takes you from 1986. If your eyesight's no better than mine, I can't see that slide very well either. But it starts with the creation of that voluntary body. You get the Transport Authority. You get a number of initiatives which develop different functions, all delivered at the Greater Manchester scale. And a number of initiatives which start to develop public-facing strategy documents, very much based around economic prosperity and economic development. Where government comes into this story is very late in the day, with the collapse of this ill-fated regionalism that we had in England. We had a Chancellor of the Exchequer who represented one of those constituencies just below Greater Manchester, so the leafy suburbs, but with a direct connection with lots of interaction with Manchester. He embraced the idea of metropolitan governance and was faced at one time with a choice. Greater Manchester has always been a kind of confident and challenging place for national governments. So there was a critical moment in, I think, 2008, where Greater Manchester tried to claim at least 50% of the national exchequer contribution to infrastructure programmes, and made the big argument that we too can do what you've done in London, introduce a congestion charge and use the proceeds, the revenue from that congestion charge, together with this huge dollop of national government capital, to introduce congestion charging with all of the environmental and economic benefits that would bring. What then happened was that a scheme was put together by the 10 voluntary districts acting in concert. It was agreed by 8 of the 10 districts. 2 of them stuck it out right until the end, trying to get a better part of the package. Eventually, the politicians in Greater Manchester, realising that they weren't likely to get peak-level political agreement on what would have been a huge investment, and still, for many of the people involved, would have been a very welcome one, decided that they couldn't make the sums work. They'd go to a popular referendum, and it was absolutely obvious for anybody who studies these things that a popular referendum which offered jam tomorrow and payments today was not going to impress anybody. That failed. And it was at that point that the 10 districts decided that they couldn't carry on with a voluntary system of governance which allowed that sort of prize to slip from their grasp, and increasingly made the argument to national government that they should be thinking about resurrecting some form of metropolitan governance. That's the short story. The way in which the Metropolitan Authority that I'm part of came about, the GMCA, was that at the end of the previous Labour government, there was a decision made to create what effectively was a kind of shell organisation. So no new resources. The only thing that goes into the shell that is called the GMCA are some fairly interim forms of governance. So nobody's directly elected at this point. The only thing that will populate it is either the districts getting together and saying we will share resources for these purposes between ourselves, or the big D word in the UK, devolution. It needs to be populated by things divested from national government and put in the hands of locals. So when people talk about devolution in England, don't get carried away by the idea that this is devolution as a political scientist would describe it. This is not the permanent passing down of powers to a directly elected body in perpetuity with all the resourcing mechanisms that are needed to run the various services. These are often very different forms of, in quotes, devolution, which look a lot more like delegation, if we're honest about it. But what happened once the GMC was created as a shell was that there was a series of deals, and they were called different things. They were called city deals, they were called devolution deals. All of them had the word deal in the title. And because GM was at the head of the queue, in terms of making representations to government to give these new institutions some voice and form, there was something like 6 deals agreed between national government and GM in a period of about 4 or 5 years. That whole deal-making process came to a bit of a juddering halt in 2016. Those of you with decent short-term memories will recognise the importance of 2016. I'm sure I'm going to get some questions about it later. I'm not going to say anything for the moment. But we had a short and intense period where there was very active consideration of a whole set of asks and demands from Greater Manchester about what it could do better with the new institution than the current system is capable of delivering. And the sort of things that were in those packages are just summarised briefly on that slide. Transport is a huge feature of this. So devolving transportation funding on a long-term basis and making it apparent. Making the integration of things like the train, the bus, the ticketing system, all the sorts of things you've started trying to do in Toronto as well. Health and social care is by far the biggest delegated function. It doesn't lie within the GMCA, but it is one of the areas which is overseen by the political representatives of the GMCA. GMCA, incidentally, has only one directly elected politician, that's the mayor. All of the rest of the decision making is through the existing districts. So each of them lead on some aspect of metropolitan government and strategy, be it health, be it social care, and so on. Health and social care delegation is a very big deal indeed. Nobody else has done it apart from GM. And the idea behind that is to try and get beyond the separation of clinical health and public health, which exists in the rest of the country, and is tending to generate crises on things like bed blocking within the hospital system, creating a better system of enabling people to live independently. So GM acquired all of the budgets. A GM institution, the Health and Social Care Partnership, acquired all of the budgets, but they are each still run by the independent institutions, the hospitals, the local authorities. But there are some possibilities of pooling resources, so making the machine act more sensibly. And there is an extra fund which enables GM to anticipate some of the future potential crises and develop some early interventions which are capable of saving money later on in terms of crisis management. Strategic planning, we're currently going through a big exercise in coming up with a new strategic plan. Skills budgets, European fundings, some flexibility around local rates, which are not available everywhere. And in addition to all of the stuff that enables, what the Mayor has been able to do, not least because he's formerly a very significant national politician, is first of all put GM on a national and international stage, but also use some of his soft convening power to tackle stuff that actually he's got no power, formal power at all to be able to achieve. So top of his list of priorities for his first 3-year term, it's not a long one, is all about trying to address homelessness and issues of housing affordability through a voluntaristic approach, leaning on different institutions to provide part of the package. I'm not going to go through all of the stuff on recent strategy in detail. What we've effectively done is fuse the Mayor's set of campaign promises into a pre-existing economic development dominated strategy. So it now looks a lot different. There are now many more sort of social policy aspects of the GM strategy than there were 3 years ago. The Mayor decided to go down that route because he heard very loudly and clearly the voices of some of the less fortunate and more detached areas of Greater Manchester demanding a better deal from what was happening in the centre of the conurbation. That remains a really important part of the politics. I've had a 10-minute warning. I've got a 5-minute warning now. Just very quickly, let's leave the so what question to Shirley and I, shall we? What are the reasons this has happened in Greater Manchester? The first one is it's just grown together as a conurbation. It's really simple stuff, but I'm going to show you a series of maps which kind of cheat because what they show you are buildings at a particular point in time that were built in particular periods. So the remaining buildings from stuff built in a particular period. It'll make sense when I show them to you. So that's the earliest slide we got, and I can't even read the date on there. I think that's pre-1910. Has somebody got sharp eyes? So this is a century's worth, basically, of built environment change. You can see in that early part the built-out nature only at the centre of the conurbation. As we move forward through time, I think that's just pre-World War I. Those outer towns to the north begin to fill out. The centre of the conurbation begins to fill out. And little by little over time with the process of suburbanisation, all of that middle section by 2005 is built out. And you've got distinct transport connections linking each of the towns. I usually say at this point, Manchester is where the cotton exchange was. All of those towns in the north are where the cotton mills were. So there's always been economic connections between the centre and the periphery. The economy works to solidify those relationships. So by far the most important part of GM's labour market are the high-paying jobs at the centre of the conurbation in 3 districts, not just Manchester. And it's very important that it's 3 because that's where the idea of GM came from originally. So just a few illustrations of the red-hot nature of the labour market at the centre of the conurbation. The one to the south there is the airport. An interdependent labour market, so that central red-hot bit of the economy serves all of the conurbation. It serves some places better than others, and there's another slide I can show you later to demonstrate that. But you can see the sort of the shared nature of the value created at the centre. And we invest in an evidence base. We've done that for 2 reasons. One, because we want to impress our lords and masters in national government. And the way you do that is by trying to take politics out of the conversation. So there's been 2 major points, one in 2008, one very recently, where we've had the confidence to go out to the market, as it were, to invest in research programs, looking at the sort of near and longer term futures potentially of the conurbation, having that delivered independently, and then using that as a basis for some of the cases that we've made to national government. And the most recent example, you may recognise one of the 2 people, Ed Glazer up at the top right there, Harvard urban economist, Henry Overman below him, famous in my little country, Diane Coyle, again a national and internationally known popular economist. And the final reason is all about leadership, and I've got 3 old white men in the picture, and I have to be unapologetic about that because it was them and not other people. I know one face in the audience in particular will recognise all 3. Joe. Top left is Howard Bernstein. Sir Howard Bernstein, recently retired Chief Executive of Manchester City Council, a job he had from 1996, but even for the previous decade he was effectively running the place, if the truth be known. Next to him is Richard Leese, still the leader of Manchester City Council, and a place he's occupied since 1996. And the guy at the bottom is not usually mentioned in the same breath, but is a guy called Lord Peter Smith, who was the leader of one of the peripheral district authorities, Wigan. And they very sensibly chose the leader of Wigan, the least engaged in many ways in GM politics, to be the chair of that voluntary association. So political choice and political machinations are at the centre of it. The point being that these people were around for a very long time. They were never in any danger of losing their positions, not least because of the voting patterns in the areas they serve. They could take a longer term perspective, and they did it, in my view, very effectively. I think that goes to the end of my slides. I'm going to leave the so what question for Shirley to pose with me. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. That was fascinating. Well, we have time. It took them 30 years, so we're only 20 years into the amalgamation of Toronto, so we've got a lot more time yet to look at how from Toronto we can get to the GTA discussion. I want to start the conversation with Alan, and I think, if you permit me, I may suggest that we take perhaps maybe 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to open up to the audience, because I look at this group, there's a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, and probably a lot more comments about where we are now at in terms of Toronto amalgamation, but also consideration of the GTA region, whether on what I would say as a special purpose or program-specific first kind of look at where we may go and a regional governance approach, such as, for example, transit. And you said, and you're right, that's a major issue right now in terms of consideration of a regional approach to service delivery and indeed also policy development. And then having, been through sort of a single tier regional governance approach with the amalgamation in Toronto. We want to talk more about the implications of that. But I want to ask you the question where you left off in your final slide, Alan. Political will, political leadership. You talk about the need for stable political leadership, and that's critical for sure. Because I think in each of the major milestones that we have experienced, there was a political will to make something happen, right? So can you talk a bit more about the political will in terms of consensus by the three leaders that you talked about, whether they were coming at it in the same way or there were different objectives that they were trying to achieve when they talk about creating the Greater Manchester Combined Authority?
Okay. So I think I said as I was moving through the slides that Manchester is the first among equals in Greater Manchester. It's the city that really led the movement towards the new metropolitan structures that we've got now, and it started that in a very small way, really. So the old county was abolished in 1986. A couple of years after that, there was quite a major recession. Manchester at that point had been losing manufacturing jobs for 20 years. The initial response to that from the city was to try and think about the new manufacturing and where it was going to come from. What it started to see taking shape around it was the reuse of many of those industrial buildings and the areas of the city they used to be in for a whole range of different sorts of purposes. So there was something happening in terms of market signals, if you like. But the leadership of Manchester City Council very quickly managed to develop programmes and projects which gave more impetus to that market-led change, particularly through national government programmes of one sort or another, so regeneration programmes. What it very quickly realised is that in doing so and beginning to turn around the centre of the conurbation, the bit that is now so lively, was that the benefits of that spread far and wide outside of Manchester. And there had to be some quid pro quo in terms of some of those benefits being integrated in some way into the decision-making process. So what tended to happen, I kind of glossed over this for the purposes of simplicity, but many of those institutions that were built started with the city of Manchester, the neighbouring city of Salford, and the two are functionally connected as one bit of post-industrial kit, if you like. There's very little difference between them, and an area called Trafford. Now Trafford has a little bit of that central sort of hot area, but it also has some of the choicest suburbs in Greater Manchester. Initially, it was those three who would get together around inward investment promotion, visitor attraction, stuff like that. And little by little, as those things established their credibility and their success, the rest of the conurbation bought into it. So the guy at the bottom in that picture, the leader of Wigan, would come into it in that second stage where the argument was made, three authorities are getting together, we really need to build the capacity of these organisations. We need to present a single face to our national government, we need your help in trying to create the argument for a GM-wide approach. And it's at that stage where some of the more provincial characters come into play.
Okay. Is there a sense that you may be over-governed with this structure, two-tier? You didn't do away with the 9 districts. Is there, certainly from our experience, one of the reasons why we talk about a regional governance approach and the milestone years that I mentioned, there was also a sense we want to be more efficient. That was also the political message as well. And that if we're going to do anything, not only to improve service delivery, but we want to have administrative efficiency. And that's still the debate about what happened in Toronto, It certainly costs us a lot more. And you had indicated in your comments that you have to invest before you can create that structure. But right now, is there a sense that there may be too much government?
I don't think so. So I didn't mention London, which is the only other roughly comparable area in England. And national government does things for London. National government prioritises London for infrastructure investment, for all sorts of goodies, because most of the decision makers in the UK are actually based in our capital, and that's the way it works. But the London structure is more complex than the Greater Manchester one. So Greater Manchester has very deliberately gone down a track of kind of reusing political capacity for extra work, effectively. So as I said, each of the council leaders has a portfolio on which they lead on behalf of Greater Manchester. Their particular chief executive will support them in those duties. So it's not the GM machine is not big. I often say to people, what do you imagine is the most common job in the GMCA? It's actually firefighter. Because we've got the fire service within the organisation. Actually, the bureaucracy that supports the strategic and the research and the development function is still only about 300 people. I've no doubt it will grow over time, but this is quite a lean system, politically and in terms of executive people, if not capacity. If you want a place that's overgoverned, go to France, I'd say. Where, as well as those 36,000 mayors, you've got a department, you've got a region, you've got agglomerations, and you've got national government, at least 5 tiers of government to contend with.
Okay. So am I correct to say that given the way that the Greater Manchester Combined Authorities created, that the concern that we have had here in Toronto is the citizen engagement, the involvement of the citizens given the restructuring we've gone through, and there's a sense of huge loss by citizens to really be able to be consulted, but also be directly involved in terms of decision-making at the local government level. Can you comment a bit about what you guys have experienced through that?
Yeah, so there are 2 parts to that story, really. Because Greater Manchester was trying something quite different and quite innovative and trying to move at the pace of the fastest rather than the slowest, I think it's fair to say that it had a reputation of being fairly closed. Might even say elitist. That's got a different set of connotations nowadays in the UK. That couldn't last forever. What happened when we moved towards, we created the GMCA as this shell organisation, and then we had the first election for the directly elected mayor. And he's a capable politician. He did his homework. He's got ears on the street. It was, so the election campaign was back end of 2016, early 2017. He was elected in May of that year. And that time was dominated by the B word, which we haven't used as yet, but I'm sure will come up in the discussion. So in the referendum, 7 of the districts, the voting public in 7 of the districts of the 10 Greater Manchester district authorities voted to leave the European Union. And those in the remaining 3 districts, which it won't surprise you to hear, are the most metropolitan, the most cosmopolitan, the most mixed, the youngest, the best educated. The choice was to remain. And he heard that very powerfully, and he heard what was behind it rather than what the vote was. And what's behind it is a feeling that, you know, modern forms of economic change are putting some people at a distinct disadvantage. It's not the case in Greater Manchester that all of those people live in the peripheral places. Many of them live very close to all of the new shiny jobs which are appearing right at the centre. But nonetheless, that political moment made it impossible for the mayor to go on with a fairly technocratic and closed system of government. He had to demonstrate that his ears were open, and he had to deliver on many of the promises about greater forms of engagement. So we've had the creation of all sorts of different mechanisms for engaging different cadres of the Greater Manchester public, whether it's based on ethnicity or gender or disability or age. There's been a whole proliferation of mechanisms for taking the temperature of public debate in a way that wasn't previously.
Okay. My final question to you before I open it up is kind of lessons learned from this experience and what you would advise us. Because I think the one area, and you've already mentioned it, that we certainly are looking at in terms of more of a regional approach is in the public transit area, right? And you may have heard that our provincial government has talked about maybe taking over some of the current functions of Toronto, but looking at perhaps a different way of doing delivery of the transit systems right across the region. So from your experience there, what would you say to us as to the pitfalls to watch for, lessons learned from the way, it sounds as though it came up that way in the development anyways, in that you had major services from the national government to your metro structure, but it was almost, you know, as you mentioned, deal by deal through those 5-6 years before it became a full regional order government. Yeah,
okay. So I think in the most general sense, the backbone of any metropolitan region is its transportation systems, and particularly public transit. So what we have in the UK is a system where responsibility for different aspects of those systems are vested in different bodies at different levels of the state. So within GM's gift, as it were, is the new tram system, which has been expanded incrementally as resources have allowed. So that now takes care of, I think, between 5 and 10% of journeys to work, which is not huge, but the system is growing and is popular. We don't as yet have power over regulation of buses. So we went through a privatisation moment in the 1980s. London never surrendered its control over the buses, and it got lots of national government finance to do all sorts of stuff around smart ticketing, information, signage. London, I think, now is one of the best places in the world to get around. And the sophistication and the reach of that machine is growing all the time. We want the same in Greater Manchester. And the way to do that, we're arguing, is to begin to divest those powers from the national to the local level. So if you can believe some of the promises of our Prime Minister at the moment, and remember, he may have an election to cope with, and he may be making a lot of promises to a lot of people at the moment. We may be on the journey to reacquiring control over some of the contracting of the major regional train routes. So these are heavy trains, these are intercity trains. It's a complex system. I've not seen the detail of what the Prime Minister has in mind. I dare say there isn't a great deal at the moment, but nonetheless, we're on the same journey, basically. So, you know, having established capacity and performance in one field, the next stage is to add other elements of the system, so that it's all genuinely controlled, coordinated, and joined up at the regional scale.
Good. Okay. So we will now open it up for questions or comments to Alan. So, okay, we'll start on this side, and then we'll go to this side. We'll just go row by row.
Marcy Birchfield from the Toronto Region Board of Trade. My question at first was, you know, why start? So if I understood you correctly, the voluntary nature of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority started with economic development, and then basically went into regional institutions for the purpose of economic development, correct?
Yeah.
As opposed to something like, to Shirley's point, transportation.
Yeah.
But now I think I kind of get it, because part of that is a national government responsibility.
Yeah.
But that is probably the most competitive nature of the districts and here municipalities. It seems so odd to me that people came together in a voluntary nature to do that, you know, as one. We have had struggles with that here, and we really only managed, you know, more recently to get a regional economic not regional economic development, but a regional FDI agency.
Yeah.
And still, we're at a point where, is that going to last or not?
Yeah.
So maybe you can speak to that a little bit. Is it the nature of, you know, manufacturing being such a, you know, change, you know, major industry in Manchester, and then, you know, the drastic change? So if you could speak to that point.
So I think part of the success of those institutions, and they're not separate institutions anymore, they're all being folded into the GMCA structures. But the Inward Investment Agency, as I said, started off life as representing the core of the conurbation. And that's kind of an easy sell. It's you know, so you're selling the sorts of regional service functions that area performs. You're selling its universities and its research base, its connectedness, and so on and so forth. Drawing the outer boroughs into support for that, and being seen to deliver for them, has never been easy. They continue to make their contributions. So at one level, at that very basic level, there's a degree of content, at least with what it's doing. But clearly the sale around some of the more peripheral areas is much more on different chains of activity. It's much more on logistics and other forms of economic activity. There's still quite a lot of advanced manufacturing within GM. I mean, manufacturing numbers have collapsed over 40 years, but there's still something like 10, 11, 12%, even within Manchester, still engaged in manufacturing, probably less so in Manchester actually, but maybe up to 15 in some of those boroughs. So trying to create connections between some of the interesting stuff going on in universities, for example, be it around advanced materials and design processes, in some of the traditional strengths that we've got in Manchester. We don't call ourselves Cottonopolis anymore, but there's still pretty substantial textile producers within the conurbation. So it's really trying to be inclusive in an economic strategy by catering for different sorts of environments, I suppose. And the fact that the institutions are still popular suggests that they've probably got that balance pretty good.
Thank you. Zach?
One of the basic dynamics in North American metropolitics, right, is that North American local governments are very dependent on the property tax, which gives them a strong incentive to fight for spoils, to create conflict as they try to attract development into their own territories.
Yeah.
Now, the UK is way more fiscally centralized,
Yeah.
Although that's changing a bit. How does that change the calculus of intergovernmental cooperation when you're less dependent on the property tax maybe than you are in North America? Did that make it easier for there to be to work together?
I think the honest short answer is probably yes, Zach, to be honest. So quite a lot of the developmental politics at a local level in England is frankly finding more better, sophisticated ways of extracting funding from government. And we dress that up in all sorts of different ways, but that's the game that the deals process plays. That's the game that I think Greater Manchester has been pretty sophisticated at. But what's come out of that process is something else entirely, and I think the mayor can take some of the credit for this. He's actually thinking, well, if we can do this through a sophisticated begging bowl strategy, perhaps there's things we can do from our own resources for ourselves just as well. So some of those really difficult things that no city in the advanced world has managed to solve, I think. Generations of people left behind by deindustrialization, by the change in the labour market, by poor quality jobs in low grade service industries. All of that syndrome is just as powerful in Greater Manchester as elsewhere. What the practice of doing metropolitan governance is starting to alert us to, I think, is actually we can start to make a difference to this sort of stuff as well, because we've got commissioning power over 2.8 million people, delivering services for those people through the districts, through national government agencies, through a whole plethora of different mechanisms. It's not beyond our wit to think of more intelligent ways of doing that stuff with the sort of machinery that we're capable of creating. But, does the absence of tax competition help you get together? It certainly does.
Okay. I think we've got time for about 3 more questions, okay? Bruce and then Bill and somebody back there too.
So the early stages of this whole organizational shift also corresponded, if I'm not mistaken, in the 80s at least, with the privatization of utilities, water, wastewater, and electrical utilities. Yeah. Looking back now 30 years, has that helped or hindered, do you think, progress in the other city building initiatives? Has it freed up budgetary capacity and done things that, in hindsight, are helpful?
I think that might actually differ by utility. So, I mean, going back to the transportation stuff, there's very little. I think there's now broad consensus actually within the UK that the privatisation movement in public transit trains has been not a great success. So it's a breaking up delivery of track from delivery of services and purchasing of stock and stuff. It's led in some cases to much suboptimal delivery, and that becomes part of the devolution conversation. With stuff like water and gas, electricity, from a city building perspective, it just makes things more complicated. So, whereby under previous guises they were effectively separated and run individually, but there was some public input into the governance of those things. Privatisation means that you just have to act very intelligently with each of the major providers, particularly if you're trying to get a big new site connected in all the ways that you need connected. It's a logistical minefield of investment plans not speaking to each other and stuff like that. So, it helps to have a system of governance which is seen as entitled to deal with privatised industries, but on a practical level, my guess is it's just a little bit more difficult than it used to be in the previous regime.
Okay. I think there was a question at the back, and then I'll come back to Bill's last question.
Hi, Nick Lombardo. I'm the postdoc here at IMFG. I guess you mentioned a little bit about some of the potentials for regional governance in the relationship to other scales. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to maybe some of the Brexit or no Brexit potentials for regional governance to actually carry out these kind of things that have real effects. So I'm thinking in particular of, you mentioned the airport as an economic driver that really depends on these kind of connections well beyond the national scale, and whether this is actually a sort of possibility with regional governance.
That sounds like a big question. I don't know if you could do it in a minute.
So, I mean, at its base, the Greater Manchester strategy has been very much about assets, actually. So you mentioned the airport. Loads of interesting connections, which include sporting connections, the football clubs, some of the major oil-producing states, some of the families involved in that, investments in sports, investment in housing and stuff. So, in some ways, Greater Manchester is trying to leap a scale beyond the national into the international, tapping sovereign wealth. That's one big aspect of it. In terms of the relationship with national government and where the devolution stuff might go, we've kind of been playing a game really for quite a long time now, which from a Greater Manchester perspective has meant us saying to national government, whatever you do, don't standardise. Whatever you do, don't close down potential where there is some willingness to innovate, to experiment, to build stuff, just because it would be fair to do that everywhere. And it's not easy for a national government to hear that message. So part of that message is just the fundamental importance of big urban labour markets to the future of us all. But part of it is also a game played whereby Manchester can say, yeah, but Birmingham's not ready. or Sheffield needs to do something different. So it's retaining the capacity to have a variegated system, which moves with the pace of the fastest and not the slowest. The big open question that I've got, and I've been trying to prepare colleagues on this one, is we kind of, whichever way that goes, whether we go for a first system which is distributed or we reward the faster movers, the assumption is that this devolution stuff is kind of going to be, it's going to be iterative, kind of technocratic. It builds on stuff that's already there. The big open question is whether devolution, as we've had it in the non-English parts of the UK, is going to continue in its current much more advanced state. So one scenario is that, Scotland's not going to be part of the UK in 30 years' time. What does that do for devolution claims from the rest of the country? It gives them a shot in the arm. There's no doubt about it. We're only in the very early stages of thinking through what some of those things might mean, because nobody's quite clear what is going to happen. But the promise we've been making to ourselves has kind of been, it's fine, it'll develop organically. It might develop with one big shock, actually.
Last question to Bill.
Thank you. Oops. So I have a three-part question, so just answer whichever part you want to answer. And the aim of this question is to try and connect up the discussion you had about theory at the beginning to the reality of practice.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you are aware of any evidence that services are being delivered either at a higher level of quality or more efficiently under a metropolitan governance arrangement?
Yeah.
And whether you have any views on whether it's possible to be too big for even metropolitan governance? Like, are there diseconomies of scale that create limits on the size of a metropolitan governance geography?
Yeah.
And then the third part of it is, are you aware of any services that are definitely delivered better at the local, or I think you called them district level?
Yeah. Just on that one first, because it's connected to your first point as well. We shouldn't overstate the degree of change that the GMCA existence has brought about. Most of the services delivered by local government continue to be delivered by the districts. The hope is that they do that in combination more intelligently as a result of being part of a broader strategy. But still, service delivery responsibility rests mainly at that level, particularly on personal services. And we've gone through a pretty difficult process post financial crash of austerity, which has cut some of the resources to local government to the bone. So ask those questions in districts, they'll give you a positive answer, but they'll point to the broader context as shaping what's possible. The things that GM has done tend to be sort of piloting and experimenting with different bits of different services. So, the proudest answer we've got, we took over responsibility for some of the employment training schemes which were formerly delivered by delivered through national contracts to local and regional entities, private entities. Taking the most difficult of people who are furthest away from the labour market and trying to develop their skills and confidence to the extent that they can get jobs is a big part of that aspect of service delivery. The national scheme before GM took it over was getting something like 1 in 10 people who went through that system into some sort of productive activity. GM made its job more difficult for itself by taking people who had failed to get anything through the government scheme, and is delivering twice the benefit of the previous regime. So it's difficult to give you a generalised answer because the nature of the activity is so particular. But that's just one claim we're confident about making. We can also claim, I've not seen the facts and figures to back this one up, but the Mayor says it, so it must be true. The investment pot that we got to do experimental stuff with health and social care to prevent future costs, we've saved at least as much as that pot gave us through efficiency savings through the existing system. Playing with the debt financing of individual institutions, rescheduling debt, rationalisation of services, but still making them accessible to people across GM. So there's a whole lot of particular answers that I can give, but we haven't done that general thing, and we're 3 years into a process.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe for concluding this session. Thank you very much, Alan.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gabriel Edelman. I'm the director of the Urban Policy Lab here at the Monk School. We like to think of ourselves as the training ground for urban policy professionals, both aspiring students here at the Monk School and practicing policy professionals. So it was my pleasure to be part of the group that brought Alan over across the pond to join us and to share his wisdom and his lessons. If I may, I'd like to just summarize a few takeaways that I got from the conversation. 3 of the 4, I would say, really resonated with me as a Torontonian and thinking through the metropolitan situation we have here. 4 was quite new to me, and I'll leave it to you to digest. So one of the takeaways that I got here was that this is very much, and it needs to be, an evolutionary process. Right? Don't expect a big bang, And here in Toronto, we've often been a victim of the Big Bang, so that's probably a good thing. Two is that a lot of this, whatever good comes out of these metropolitan governance schemes, often comes as a result of political serendipity. And I think that's a natural conclusion across many different city regions. And so sometimes we just have to cross our fingers and hope for the best. And we've seen both the good side and the bad side of waiting for that kind of serendipity. Third, and this was music to my ears as an academic, is the importance of investing in research to create an evidence base. More of that, please. That'd be wonderful. But in the Toronto context, that's quite interesting. There have been some movements towards that in the Toronto GTA context. Marcy's in the front row here. The Regional Board of Trade is moving that direction. The universities are moving that direction. The fourth, maybe it's not so new, but it was never put to me in that way. Maybe it's time we build a shell organization to think about metropolitan governance here in Toronto. To build a shell company. I don't know the business games that might be involved in building up that shell, but to translate it to the Toronto context, maybe that's just a version of what we like to do best, which is pilot things. The shell organization is kind of a pilot project. If metropolitan governance hasn't always worked out the way we wanted it to work out here in the GTA, maybe it's time that we apply our favorite, or at least recently our favorite policy tool, which is a metropolitan pilot project. So those are four takeaways that I take from Alan's wonderful talk. So thank you again. It left me with questions, particularly when you were running down the timeline of the evolution in the Manchester experience, and Shirley alluded to this. Are we in the Toronto area just 20 or 30 years behind? Because that timeline looked quite familiar to me at certain points in time. We're looking and seeing now more issue-specific regional governance initiatives. And if so, is it an inevitability that we're moving down that path, or is this something that has to be produced? So I leave that question for the audience, for you to ponder, to discuss and debate going forward. And just a final round of thank yous to all of you for attending, to the Monk School, obviously, for its support, to Enid and Thomas, IMFG. Working with you is always a treat. To Shirley for moderating, expert moderation, as always, and of course to Alan for sharing his insights and wisdom. I think Thomas would probably want me to add that this recording, there'll be a posting of this recording up online. You can sign up for the IMFG's newsletter outside. You can access the Urban Policy Lab website, urbanpolicylab.ca. But otherwise, thank you all for coming and have a great evening.